Axis of this talk, if you will, was we have a project that we're working on this year, and this is kind of, in a nutshell, what it is. It's sort of to try to find a cooperative approach to groundwater management that could serve as a conceptual model for sustained aquifer use and provide landowner incentives to regulate extraction while enhancing recharge using beneficial land management practices. In a nutshell, the way that I've sort of taken that, and within this institute we have smaller groups that are working on this project. Our group, in a sense, has taken this as trying to discover a way to show that there's a public benefit to private lands. And that's sort of the tactic we're using here. And get a little deeper into that. Of course, it's not changing slides here. So
click on the slide.
Click on the slide.
And then try to move.
All right, there we go. So the issue, as I see it, is we're losing private lands. And this relates to groundwater in several ways. It's a little stat here from a website I got. It's actually Land Trends, A&M did. We're losing about an acre of farmland per minute in the United States, which is kind of frightening. And most lands, obviously, I think we all know that, are privately owned. On a national scale, we're talking about 64%, 60 to 70%. And you can see, obviously, I think it's obvious to everyone in the room, there's sort of a line of demarcation here where you have mostly public lands in the west, lots of private lands, of course, in Texas and all across the southeast. So effective conservation is going to require innovative solutions to sustain these private working lands. So in a way, we need to halt the loss of private lands in some ways. Again, I'm going to try to tie this back to groundwater. And so I think in terms of groundwater, we need to make the case that private lands provide a public benefit. That's sort of the bottom line here. And let's zoom in a little bit to Texas here. This again is from Land Trends and just shows, instead of a national scale, what's happening in Texas. So we have about 142 million acres of farms, forests, and rangelands. So we're thinking of, in my mind, places where we would want it to look a certain way to get good recharge if we're going to bring it back to groundwater, right? We want rural working land. So we have about 142 million acres of that. And this is from '07. Land Trends will be updated this year too, so we'll have some more current numbers. And, you know, looking at things like land consumption rates, and you can see obviously the I-35 corridor is a real hot spot for growth here where we're losing a lot of land. And 40% of this conversion, if you will, from rural working lands into urban areas is in 25 high growth counties. So there, like I said, there's some hot spots for sure. Kind of all goes back to economics at a certain point. So if you look at Land Trends again in '07, the average market value of a farm, ranch, or forest land, this is very average, but about $1,196 per acre. So lots of variation there. But if we're just going to look at an average. Profitability, fewer than 50% of ag holdings less than 500 acres reported generating profit. So what's the incentive to keep rural lands rural? We've got a problem there. We also have a very big disconnect between urban and rural areas, and I think this is really where you can start thinking of groundwater. 95% of Texas is privately owned. However, 90% of Texans live in urban areas. So in a sense, you've got 250,000 people that own 95% of the land. And one of the problems as I see it is that sort of this policy is often heavily influenced by that 90%. So you have this disconnect between where the people are and the rural working lands. And just some things I pulled off a site that I found that were really telling was only 13 of the 147 counties west of I-35 are considered urban. So you have that west-east split. Another interesting thing here says, and I wish I had put the site down at the bottom. I apologize. It was a good source, though. Urban taxpayers receive about $1.27 worth of service for every tax dollar spent, where rural taxpayers receive about 33 cents worth of service for every tax dollar spent. So you got this disconnect, and we often think of the disconnect too. It's very strong when you ask maybe a child from the city where his hamburger came from, and he says Walmart, right? It's not from that ranch. So we've got a disconnect here. And so how do we make this case for rural lands if we know rural lands are important for a variety of reasons? Wildlife, obviously what we eat, food, fiber, but groundwater too. And I think it's going to be pretty obvious that keeping lands rural is going to be good for groundwater. There is, however, a couple of what I put here as a template for success. And so sort of our group within this TIER Institute's in investigating what we find to be a really interesting case study in San Antonio. So this is where I think they really made a good case for the value of private lands when it comes to groundwater. So SAWS is the San Antonio Water Service, I believe. And what's really interesting about this particular area is, you have the Edwards Aquifer. There's very, very minimal water treatment in San Antonio, from what I've heard. From some people, I believe it was another guy from the Water Development Board or the Aquifer Authority that talked to us in Bandera. It's got some of the cleanest drinking water, and all they do is add a few drops of chlorine. So what happens is this rainwater obviously is hitting in the recharge zone, these rural private areas, and it's coming out pretty darn clean. So you're saving a lot of money as far as water treatment and whatnot. And so couple that with this willingness to pay study that I mentioned here, which A&M did, which went to this area in eastern Comal County and sort of one of those recharge zone areas, and did the study saying, how much would the public be willing to pay for the, keeping these areas rural or whatever? And public was willing to pay up to $1,566 per acre just to protect these recharge lands. This all kind of led to what I'm sure a lot of you guys have heard. I believe it's like a 0.07, something, the number may not be right, increase in the sales tax in that area. And that goes to keeping these areas, rural areas, so that you get this recharge. And so sort of this template for success, this idea that you can talk to the public, the people in San Antonio, and convince them that these lands are very valuable for their everyday life. And this was in reference to groundwater. So it's like they got it there. So there's some way to convince people that live in these urban areas that these rural lands are very important. And Doug will talk about this. I mean, I was talking about leveraging, on the previous slide here, leveraging public funds. Well, there's a SWIFT fund, and I don't know enough about it. And so I'm really happy to have Doug here. And some questions that came up in my mind were how can these SWIFT funds be used to address this idea of the benefit of private lands, seeing things through the lens of private lands, and loans versus grants, what types of projects might be funded? Those are some things I'm kind of interested in, and probably the folks that are online right now might be really interested in too, besides just the basics that you'll be talking about today.